Thanks for those kind words, Mark, and again, thank you to Iranda, our host, and for organising this session tonight for me. Just moving my screen around, but can you just check, Mark, you can see that screen in full?
Yeah, it's good, thank you.
Yeah. Moving around the globe again, I'm in East Coast Australia in the state of Victoria, a consultant with GHD, active in Australia, but across the Pacific and further afield in consultancy, as Mark introduced, and fortunate enough to have been involved in a number of different studies and strategies across the Pacific, which I'll share some of those insights with you today. I'm going to touch on a few points that have already been raised, to be fair. And I am very conscious of time, and we're well over, but I just wanted to draw your attention to a few points and really just try and join some dots from that perspective. But climate change impacts affecting Pacific ports is obviously increasing the scale and frequency of weather and disaster events. They're getting to the point where they are significant. Cumulative combinations of extreme design loads and effects that we need to be conscious of and considering now and into the future. And with that, there are increases to the vulnerability and the suitability of the current port infrastructure settings that exist across the Pacific region. Importantly, when we think forward under the different pathways that could exist from an emission scenarios, we don't actually know what the scale of impacts might ultimately be. By best endeavours, we may be following a path which recognises under RCP 4.5, for example, but it could equally be out to RCP 6 and out into 8.5. In our planning of infrastructure development and shipping solutions, I think we need to be cognizant of the range that we might be facing in terms of impacts of those climate hazards on port infrastructure into the future. And just as an example, this is an extract from Geoscience back in 2016, which gave a snapshot of under RCP 4.5 what wave height changes might be across that Southern Pacific region or in the Pacific region for October 2100. And then that slide there shows you the scale of difference that you might see under an RCP 8.5, for example, which is representative of a high emissions pathway that the globe may take. So I think that's a key consideration for us going forward in terms of planning our infrastructure in the Pacific region. Additionally, and a number of speakers have already touched on this, but the Pacific region is different to the rest of the world. There's a vast spread of small Pacific Island countries. They're small islands, they have significantly sized EEZ zones with a number of remote communities, but also high levels of urban density in different locations. Many low-lying areas with urban centres. And sea transport is probably the most important for connectivity between Pacific Island countries than in any other society. So the implications and impacts from climate change have probably got the bigger impact to have on those communities. In the current climate, we've already heard that tourism is stalled with pandemic situations across the globe. That is incurring sort of rising debts and revenues are reduced or uncertain. And the ability to recover them from that is linked with sea transport connectivity and the sort of the optimisation from that perspective. I guess the diagram there that I've got is a lot of information on there, but trying to just show that there's a bit of a vicious cycle here that if we don't get the settings right as to how things could start to fall away. We heard from Iranda in terms of the risks that relate to sort of commercial viability and the need to get adequate funding in place. So the implications from those pathways of increasing design load effects on aging infrastructure that was designed with a different future in mind is one of increasing need to spend money on the infrastructure, potentially increased damage, which leads to a reduction in performance issues, which further exacerbates into lower productivity rates, which then includes and drives higher shipping costs. The high shipping costs with a reduce in revenue can then manifest itself in suboptimal choices of shipping procurements and ship sizes and a different mix of vessel types. The reliability, the functionality of those then contribute to differences and inconsistencies across the board going forward and going round. Those factors together can contribute to limited economic growth, further downturn in revenues, and further challenges in terms of generating products and produce that can get themselves to international markets to unlock that the downturn in economic benefits. And so there's a bit of a vicious cycle there that we need to be mindful of in terms of planning our way forward going forward. And the picture there shows the impact that cyclone tracking past Niue had in January 2020. I was fortunate to be there just before the lockdown came in to close Niue to the rest of the world last year. And yeah, they lost a significant sort of area of their wharf area there, which has the impacts of affecting the ability to track their equipment to the vessels to move containers on and off that wharf, and the key considerations that exist from that perspective. So what are the potential responses for Pacific Island countries? I just want to put some thoughts to you in this session, and we've heard consistently through the presentation so far, we do need a structured transition to a low carbon freight and operational solution. So the Pacific Island countries themselves and the transport networks have historically been heavily reliant on fossil fuels. That's a cost exposure factor that's been increasingly evident. But we need to facilitate the switch to alternative fuels and renewable power systems. And we heard from Raoul there how that might look and what that might look like. And obviously there's a significant challenge in carrying that energy product around with you. So you can move to a location or a destination and plug yourself in and charge yourself back up again with a renewable energy or battery powered electric outboard motor, then you can go back again. And maybe that's sort of the initiatives that we need to be thinking about. In ports themselves, we need renewable initiatives in place across the port authorities. We've heard from Miranda and the investment and big strides that we've heard in the Cook Islands in terms of reducing energy demands through renewable mini grids, use of renewable sources to supply that, and equipment that has a lower energy demands on it. And then I think equally, as the like of Raoul has talked about in IMO policy settings, is targets for maritime transport performance, incentives linked to financing, and objectives linked to global priorities in reducing carbon emissions. But equally, we need optimised and resilient infrastructure in place. And I have to ask the question, and people should be asking the question, do we need to do things differently? And I think we've heard that those changes are probably coming. But optimising the shipping solution to match the trade task is probably something that's highly relevant to the Pacific Island communities. Do we need 20 plus deep water berths provided across each country state now and into the future, when actually the freight task is maybe actually flatlining or reducing? So could we look at actually selected deep water hubs that facilitate enhanced international shipping using the likes of the Maersk vessels that we've heard about on powered on methanol fuels to call into those hubs, unconstrained ship size choice from those international connections, but then service the Pacific region with optimized vessel choices that are really matched to the trade task and the flexibility and the frequency of services that we really need to move freight and passengers around from that perspective. The idea of promoting competitive services in there to provide the service level that we require, but also options for those countries to make sure that they are paying for optimum prices for the freight movements. The smaller scale, more frequent, more routes to market potentially coming out through that sort of model. And then if we're able to descale the port infrastructure in some of those Pacific Island countries, rather than having big expansive footprints that potentially expose to more weather events and disaster events, could we actually have smaller but more higher number of smaller port infrastructures located across Pacific Islands in different locations so that they can be operated flexibly and in a more resilient way? If there are storm events coming on certain other sides of the island, we can switch our transport networks around to facilitate resilient port connections, but without the disruption from weather events, for example, from that perspective. And then regionally, do we need a regional solutions rather than country-specific solutions? So I think through the Nauru agreement, we've seen benefits for the Pacific region through the sharing of quotas on tuna fish stocks and selling volumes from one side of the Pacific to the other as fish move around. But thinking about that regional buy-in and regional solutions, I think is a key consideration going forward. So having standardized infrastructure regionally would provide benefits for operators, consistency in vessel types, consistency in vessel maintenance needs, and consistent functional needs to offer redundancy in the ability to provide shipping services to back up those that may be out of action from incidents that have occurred, for example, and provide that flexibility in the system. The integration of supply chain factors into regional and domestic connectivity plans. I think, routes and services that offer an opportunity to improve the balance of freight flows between domestic ports and islands is a key consideration for us going forward. And then standardised asset management plans and systems for port infrastructure and ships match to ship repair capabilities and technologies. So rather than investing in ships that last 12 months and then can't be repaired locally and it's expensive to ship them all through to Indonesia for repair, should we regionally have infrastructure that's set up in a way that, mobile dry docks that maybe come to the Pacific Island countries to provide those services to make that more effective, but equally an awareness of the shipping settings that are balanced or set to that infrastructure requirements. So the potential impacts then, just building on that could have to trade in the Pacific as well. I think that we need to be thinking around those. So I think there's further changes to the origin and destination of products that could come about through product supply costs and demand characteristics. So we've heard already there's been a shift over recent years, and that chart in the middle there on the right shows how the Pacific Island region has been shared, where traders come from. Historically, there was a more of a dominant share coming out of New Zealand and Australia, but China and Northeast Asia has become more dominant in terms of that. So the climate change impacts are going to have impacts globally. The ability of those international destinations to generate products and consumables may change. So how does that change the nature of where products may be coming to the Pacific region in the future? We need to be mindful of that. Bulk fuel and energy products. So we've heard from Roel there in terms of the future need in terms of international shipping. Totally agree. The expected decline in traditional products as renewables are adopted. Power generation is going to be a big impact on trade flows and product volumes going into the Pacific region. The charts on the bottom of that slide show you what the traditional sort of commodity types and selection of how they fare in terms of volumetric sort of differences across the Pacific region. Fuel by far has been the biggest dominant product type that's been handled across the Pacific region, but that's expected to, or the traditional fuel is expected to decline as we switch to renewable energy elements across the Pacific. So what does the future look like from that perspective in terms of trade task revenue, the choice of how we move smaller volumes of that product around, which could add unit cost to it if we don't get it right. We need to accommodate a transition to new fuel products, so hydrogen product carriers, such as ammonia and methanol, what we've heard about, and product storage and distribution. So we don't want to be carrying that around necessarily with us. Is aviation going to change as well? Marine transport is, historically provided the fuel for aviation needs. Does it continue to do that? And what is that product type that we might be needing to think about? And we need to consider the supply chain systems for renewable power systems that go with that. So ship battery recharging at ports, as Raoul sort of talked about, battery changeovers, and the chilling of products, the cool chain, supply chain issues that relate to products that might be coming out of the Pacific region as well, and the ability and the power needs that they demand need to be considered. Commercial fishing, a significant opportunity and an economic generator across the Pacific region now, and would expect to in the future. But what's the, depending on those RCP pathways, what is the extent that we're going to have on quota volumes and movement patterns of tuna fish? So the outcome and economic impact risks and flexibility in export methods are needed as well. So at the moment we have, fixed schedules to where shipping services go to export fish, but the fish move around. So how do we have solutions that need to be flexible to respond to those dynamics? Agricultural and forestry products, again, changes to the environment impacting agricultural produce, and the ability to generate such volumes is going to impact the Pacific region as well as global origins of such products. And then thinking forward, the initiatives that exist in response to climate change, what actions could arise from those? So there's an increase in waste material for recycling. So that's an export task that Pacific region potentially needs to consider. There's a backloaded opportunity that then comes from the shipping task from a economic and commercial perspective. We could be thinking about reductions in packaging volumes being shipped. So trying to reduce the volume and weight of goods that need to be moved around, but through the changes in the way that we move products and the way that they're procured by the Pacific region, which is all required in terms of that opportunity to optimize the shipping task and descale the ships that are moving products around and get that more sustainably matched together. The alignment of marine transport with aviation transport to create efficiencies. I think that's the key consideration going forward. new ship types and control systems. So will we have remote controlled small wind and power assisted vessels moving products around on a more regular or daily basis? Why not? The technology is coming, and electric outboard motors that could be, charged over with renewable technologies could be more. So there are a significant number of exciting and innovative technologies coming through the process that I think we need to be mindful in terms of planning that infrastructure and planning the shipping solutions that will be in place across the Pacific region. So yeah, that's I have tried to keep that short and sweet for you, Mark, because I'm minimising the overrun. But thank you for the opportunity again and kind words from Mark, and thank you to Mike as well and Iranda for hosting this. But yeah, thank you.